I'm Edward, glad to have your company this evening. A warm greeting tonight to our listeners in Michigan. Where are you listening from? And what is the weather like in your corner of the world? Leave a comment and join the conversation. Please remember to subscribe. Now let us begin our gentle mystery. Chapter 1. A Key That Should Not Have Been There. Spring had arrived in St. Mary Mead with its customary mixture of promise and duty. Windows that had remained firmly closed throughout the damp winter months were now flung open to admit the mild April air, and the sound of carpets being beaten could be heard from various gardens along the high street. It was the season when householders took stock of their winter arrangements and found them wanting, when silver that had seemed perfectly adequate in February now appeared to require immediate attention, and when cupboards that had served their purpose for months suddenly demanded to be reorganized with fresh paper and purposeful efficiency. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite chair near the French windows that opened onto her modest garden, had her knitting in her hands and her attention as so often divided between the rhythmic click of her needles and the gentle sounds of village life beyond. The postman had already made his rounds, whistling as he went. Mrs. Clement from the vicarage had passed by with a purposeful step that suggested committee business. And now, if her internal clock served her correctly, it would soon be time for the daily ritual of morning tea. She was not, therefore, entirely surprised when her maid Gladys appeared at the door with a slightly flustered expression, and the information that Mrs. Brockhurst had called and would be grateful for a few moments of Miss Marple's time, if it were not inconvenient. It was never inconvenient, of course, though Miss Marple noted with interest that Helena Brockhurst was not a woman given to morning calls without purpose, and a widow of perhaps 50 years. Mrs. Brockhurst occupied one of the larger houses near the village green, a solid Victorian establishment with well-tended gardens and an air of comfortable respectability. She had been widowed some 7 years previously, her husband having been something in the civil service, and had settled into village life with the quiet competence of a woman accustomed to managing both household and social obligations without fuss. Mrs. Brockhurst entered the sitting room with her usual upright bearing, though Miss Marple, whose eyes were remarkably sharp for small details, observed that the caller's hands were clasped rather more tightly than usual around her handbag, and that she accepted the offer of tea with a distraction that was not quite characteristic. After the usual pleasantries about the weather and the promising display of daffodils in Miss Marple's garden, there was a moment of silence. Mrs. Brockhurst set down her teacup with care and looked directly at her hostess. "Miss Marple," she began, and then paused, as though uncertain how to continue. "I find myself in rather an awkward position. Not awkward, perhaps, so much as unsettling. I hardly know whether I ought to mention it at all." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes, bright and attentive, rested gently on her visitor's face. "I have always found," she said mildly, "that when something unsettles us, it is generally better to speak of it than to let it grow larger in one's mind through silence." Mrs. Brockhurst nodded, seeming to gather her thoughts. "You will think me foolish, I dare say. It is not as though anything has been taken. Nothing appears to have been disturbed. And yet—" She stopped again, and then said with sudden directness, "I have discovered that a second key to my house exists. A key that I did not have made, that I did not authorize, and that I cannot account for in any way." The knitting needles paused for the briefest moment, then resumed their gentle clicking. "How very curious," Miss Marple said. "And how did you come to discover this?" "Quite by chance," Mrs. Brockhurst replied. She seemed relieved to have spoken the words aloud, and now the explanation came more freely. "My cleaning woman, Mrs. Dobbs, mentioned yesterday that she had needed to return a key to Mr. Fletcher, the locksmith. She thought I ought to know, in case I had been wondering where it was. But you see, Miss Marple, I had not been wondering. I have my own key, which I keep in my handbag, and there is the spare that hangs in the pantry on its proper hook, as it always has. When I questioned Mrs. Dobbs further, it emerged that there had been a third key, that Mr. Fletcher had found it among his things when tidying his shop and recognised it as belonging to my front door. He could not recall making it, though he acknowledged that it was certainly cut from his shop. And Mr. Fletcher gave this key to your cleaning woman? Miss Marple inquired. He gave it to Mrs. Moore, Mrs. Brockhurst corrected. Mrs. Geraldine Moore, you understand. She happened to be in his shop at the time, and as she often helps with various errands in the village, she offered to return it. She brought it to Mrs. Dobbs yesterday, explaining that she had not wished to trouble me directly as she knew I was occupied with the spring cleaning. Most considerate, Miss Marple murmured. Yes, most considerate indeed. Mrs. Brockhurst's tone suggested that consideration was not quite the quality she found most remarkable. But you see, Miss Marple, the difficulty is this. I have no recollection whatsoever of having that key made. I have lived in my house for 7 years, and in all that time I have managed perfectly well with the original key and the single spare. I am not, I think, a forgetful woman. I keep careful accounts and maintain orderly records, and I cannot imagine what circumstance would have led me to commission a third key without retaining any memory of having done so. Miss Marple set down her knitting and poured fresh tea for them both, a gesture that had the effect of creating a small, comfortable pause. It must be very unsettling, she said gently, to feel that one's house has been, if not exactly entered without permission, then at least made accessible to someone in a way one did not intend. That is precisely it, Mrs. Brockhurst said with evident relief at being understood. It is not the fear of theft that troubles me, you understand. Nothing is missing, everything is exactly as I left it. But the knowledge that someone might have, that someone could have— She left the sentence unfinished. Have you spoken to Mr. Fletcher directly? Miss Marple asked. I called upon him this morning before coming here. He was apologetic, but not particularly helpful. He said that keys are cut so frequently that he could not possibly recall every transaction, particularly if it had occurred some time ago. He suggested that I might have sent someone to collect it on my behalf and then forgotten, or that perhaps one of my visitors might have requested it during some period when I was unwell or away. He seemed to think it all perfectly ordinary and not worth troubling about. And Mrs. Moore? Miss Marple inquired delicately. What was her view? Mrs. Brockhurst hesitated. She was, as always, most kind and reassuring. When she returned the key to Mrs. Dobbs, she apparently said that these small mysteries often resolve themselves, and that I ought not to distress myself over what might prove to be a perfectly innocent misunderstanding. She suggested that perhaps I had the key made during that difficult winter 2 years ago, when I was confined to bed with the influenza, and that in my weakened state I had simply forgotten the matter. That seems a reasonable suggestion, Miss Marple observed. It does. Does it not? Mrs. Brockhurst agreed. And yet I do not believe it to be true. I may have been unwell, but Mrs. Dobbs attended to everything during that time, and I kept my house key with me throughout. There would have been no reason to have another maid. She looked at Miss Marple with something approaching desperation. Perhaps I am being foolish. Perhaps I am making much of nothing. But I cannot shake the feeling that something is not quite right. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her gaze resting thoughtfully on the garden beyond the window, where a blackbird was investigating the freshly turned earth beneath the rose bushes. I do not think you are being foolish at all, she said at last. It has been my observation that when something troubles us in this particular way, when we feel that an explanation is being offered too readily, or that our concerns are being smoothed over too quickly, there is often good reason for that feeling. You see, the human mind is quite remarkable in its ability to notice small discrepancies, even when it cannot immediately identify what those discrepancies might be. Mrs. Brockhurst looked somewhat comforted by this validation of her instincts. Then you think I ought to pursue the matter? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that you ought to trust your own judgment. If something feels wrong, it is at least worth considering whether your feeling might be justified, not necessarily by taking dramatic action, you understand, but simply by remaining observant, paying attention to small details, noticing who says what and when and why. She picked up her knitting once more, and her needles resumed their gentle rhythm. In my experience, she continued softly, the things that trouble us most are often not the obvious disruptions, but rather the quiet certainties, the knowledge that something has occurred which ought not to have occurred, even when nothing of apparent consequence has resulted from it, it is rather like discovering that someone has been reading one's private correspondence, even if that someone has taken nothing away and left no visible trace. The violation is not in what was taken, but in what was known. Mrs. Brockhurst nodded slowly, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "I am grateful for your understanding. I had worried that I was being unnecessarily anxious." "Not at all," Miss Marple assured her. "Though I would suggest, if you do not mind a small piece of advice, that you might wish to be somewhat circumspect in discussing this matter further. Villages, as I am sure you have observed, have a way of transforming small concerns into large rumours, and it would be unfortunate if what is merely a puzzle became a subject of general speculation." "I shall be discreet," Mrs. Brockhurst promised. She rose to leave, collecting her handbag and gloves. "You have been most kind." After her visitor had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in thoughtful silence, her knitting lying idle in her lap. The matter of the second key was indeed curious, and what struck her most particularly was not the existence of the key itself, but rather the certainty in Mrs. Brockhurst's voice when she spoke of it. That certainty suggested not confusion or forgetfulness, but something rather different, something that would bear watching. Through the open window she could hear the familiar sounds of the village going about its daily business. The baker's van rattling past, children playing near the green, the church clock striking the hour with its measured, reliable chime, all perfectly ordinary, all exactly as it should be. And yet, Miss Marple reflected as she took up her knitting once more, it was so often in the midst of perfect ordinariness that one found the small, significant details that others overlooked. A key that should not have been there, an explanation offered before it was requested, a reassurance that arrived too promptly to be entirely natural. Yes, she thought, it would certainly bear watching. Chapter 2. Doors left conveniently unlocked. The matter of Mrs. Brockhurst's key spread through St. Mary Mead with the particular velocity that news assumes when it concerns neither scandal nor tragedy, but rather that curious middle territory where unease mingles with uncertainty. By tea-time on the day following Mrs. Brockhurst's visit to Miss Marple, the incident had been mentioned in the butcher's shop, alluded to at the lending library, and discussed with varying degrees of concern in at least 3 separate drawing rooms. Miss Marple, encountering Miss Weathersby outside the post office on Thursday morning, learned that opinion was beginning to divide itself along predictable lines. Some felt that Mrs. Brockhurst was making rather too much of what might prove to be a simple administrative confusion. Others expressed sympathy, though this sympathy was occasionally tinged with the faint suggestion that perhaps Mrs. Brockhurst ought to keep better track of such matters. "Of course, one does sympathise," Miss Weatherby said, adjusting her shopping basket on her arm, "but I do think Helena might have simply forgotten. She has seemed rather preoccupied of late, don't you think? And Mr. Fletcher is such a careful man. If he says the key came from his shop, then surely it must have been commissioned by someone." Miss Marple agreed that Mr. Fletcher was indeed careful, and made a mental note that preoccupation was being attributed to Mrs. Brockhurst rather earlier in the proceedings than might have been expected. It was during the Friday afternoon meeting of the Church Restoration Fund Committee that Miss Marple observed the phenomenon more directly. The committee met in the vicarage drawing room, a comfortable space made somewhat less comfortable by the presence of 8 women seated on furniture designed for 5. All of whom had strong opinions about the allocation of funds recently raised through a most successful jumble sale. Mrs. Geraldine Moore arrived precisely on time, as she invariably did. She was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair worn in a neat arrangement and an air of calm capability that had made her invaluable to village organisations for more than a decade. Her husband had been a solicitor's clerk who had died unexpectedly some 12 years previously, leaving her comfortably provided for but not wealthy. She had thrown herself into village life with admirable energy, and there were few committees that did not benefit from her attendance, and fewer still that did not rely upon her willingness to undertake the practical tasks that others found inconvenient. "I do hope," she said as she settled herself into her chair, "that we might address the matter of the bell tower repairs before we become too entangled in other business. I've obtained 3 estimates as requested, and I believe we should make a decision today if we wish to have the work completed before the autumn weather sets in." This was typical of Mrs. Moore's approach: efficient, organised, and admirably focused on tangible outcomes. The committee turned gratefully to the question of bell towers, and for 20 minutes the discussion proceeded in an orderly fashion. It was only after the formal business had been concluded and tea was being served that Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, mentioned, with careful casualness, that she had heard about poor Mrs. Brockhurst's difficulty with the mysterious key. "Such an unsettling thing," Mrs. Clement said, passing the sugar bowl, "though I dare say there is a perfectly innocent explanation. These things so often turn out to be simpler than they first appear." "Oh, quite," Mrs. Moore agreed readily. She accepted a cup of tea with a smile of thanks. "I saw Helena yesterday, and I tried to reassure her that she ought not to distress herself. I suspect what happened is simply that she commissioned the key during some busy period and then forgot about it entirely. We all do such things from time to time. I know I have occasionally discovered items in my shopping basket that I have no memory of selecting." Several ladies nodded in agreement, for this was the sort of small domestic lapse that required no deep introspection and absolved everyone of any need for concern. "Dill," ventured Mrs. Price, a thin, nervous woman who lived alone in one of the smaller cottages near the church, and who always spoke as though expecting to be contradicted. "It must be rather alarming to think that someone might have had access to one's home without one knowing about it." "Oh, but that's just it," Mrs. Moore said with gentle firmness. "There is no reason whatsoever to believe that anyone has entered Helena's house improperly. The key was found in Mr. Fletcher's shop, after all, not in someone's pocket or hidden away somewhere suspicious. Most likely it was commissioned, paid for, and then simply never collected. These things happen all the time, and all in a busy establishment." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the exchange while appearing to give her full attention to a particularly stubborn biscuit, noted that Mrs. Moore's explanation was both reasonable and remarkably complete. It accounted for every aspect of the situation and left no uncomfortable questions dangling. "I suppose you are right," Mrs. Price said, though she still looked uncertain. "It is only that I remember last year when I mislaid my own key, and I was quite worried about it until it turned up again in my sewing basket." "Exactly," Mrs. Moore said with an encouraging smile. "These small domestic mysteries have a way of resolving themselves once we stop worrying at them. I think the kindest thing we can do for Helena is to help her see that this is nothing to be alarmed about. She has been under some strain lately, I believe." "Has she?" Miss Weatherby asked with interest. "I had not noticed anything particular." "Oh, nothing serious," Mrs. Moore assured her. "But you know how it is at this time of year. The house requires so much attention, and Helena does rather insist on managing everything herself. I have offered several times to help her with various tasks, but she prefers to maintain her independence. One admires it, of course, but it can lead to unnecessary stress." The conversation drifted to other matters after that, but Miss Marple continued to think about what had been said and, more particularly, about what had been established. Mrs. Moore had offered an explanation that was both plausible and kind. She had suggested that Mrs. Brockhurst was under strain, thereby providing a context in which forgetfulness might be expected. She had praised Mrs. Brockhurst's independence while simultaneously implying that this independence might be somewhat excessive. And she had done all of this with such gentle reasonableness that no one could possibly take offence. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home through the mild spring afternoon, a masterful performance. And what struck her most particularly was that the reassurance had been offered before Mrs. Brockhurst had requested it, and the explanation had been provided before anyone had truly questioned the matter. She thought back to her own conversation with Mrs. Brockhurst, and to the widow's absolute certainty that she had not commissioned the key. That certainty had been genuine. Miss Marple felt sure of it. Mrs. Brockhurst was not a fanciful woman, nor was she given to creating difficulties where none existed. And yet here was Mrs. Moore, smoothing everything over with practiced ease, ensuring that the village would interpret the incident as a small domestic confusion rather than anything more troubling. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, observing the way the afternoon light fell across her flower beds. In her considerable experience, there were two types of people who worked to calm troubled waters. There were those who did so because they genuinely wished to prevent unnecessary alarm, and there were those who did so because they preferred that certain questions remain unasked. The difficulty lay in determining which type one was dealing with. That evening, as Miss Marple sat with her knitting and listened to the wireless, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Mrs. Moore. The woman was indeed admirable in many ways. She served on numerous committees, helped organise village events, and could always be relied upon to undertake the small practical tasks that made communal life function smoothly. She had access to a great many homes, a great many confidences, and a great many small but significant pieces of information about her neighbours' lives. And she had been, Miss Marple suddenly recalled, the person who had returned the mysterious key to Mrs. Dobbs rather than to Mrs. Brockhurst herself. There was probably nothing in that fact. It was entirely natural that Mrs. Moore should have offered to save Mr. Fletcher the trouble of dealing with the matter. It was characteristic of her helpfulness and her efficient approach to village life. And yet, Miss Marple thought as her needles clicked steadily in the lamplight, it was curious how often Mrs. Moore seemed to be present at precisely the right moment to offer precisely the right sort of help. Not suspicious, certainly, merely curious. Through the open window came the sound of someone walking past on the lane, their footsteps measured and unhurried. A dog barked briefly in the distance. The church clock struck the hour. All perfectly ordinary. Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for the notebook she kept in her sewing basket, the one in which she occasionally recorded small observations that struck her as potentially significant. She wrote down a single line, her handwriting neat and precise despite the advancing evening. Who benefits from being helpful? Then she closed the notebook, returned it to the basket, and took up her knitting once more. There was no hurry after all. In Miss Marple's experience, the truth had a way of revealing itself in its own time, provided one paid sufficient attention to the small details that others overlooked. And in St. Mary Mead, there were always small details to observe. Chapter 3, What was handed over and why. The following week brought the sort of changeable weather that April seemed to consider its particular obligation to provide. Bright mornings gave way to clouded afternoons, and washing that had been hung out in optimistic sunshine often had to be hastily retrieved before the sudden showers arrived. Miss Marple, who had lived through enough English springs to know better than to trust the early appearance of fine weather, kept her garden work modest and her observations steady. It was during a conversation with Dr. Haydock, whom she encountered quite by chance outside the greengrocer's on Tuesday, that she learned something which cast the matter of keys in a rather different light. The doctor, a sensible man in his 60s who had attended to the village's ailments and anxieties for more than 30 years, had paused to inquire after Miss Marple's health with the particular concern of one who knew that elderly ladies were often reluctant to mention their smaller difficulties. "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple assured him, "though I confess I have been thinking a good deal about keys lately." Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose slightly. "Keys? Not thinking of having your locks changed, I hope. I've always maintained that a village where people feel the need to secure everything is a village that has lost something essential." "No, indeed," Miss Marple said, "though I understand Mrs. Brockhurst has been considering the matter." "Ah, yes." The doctor's expression became thoughtful. "Poor Helena. She mentioned the business to me when I called to check on her blood pressure last week. She seemed quite troubled by it, though I tried to reassure her that these small mysteries often have perfectly mundane explanations." "I'm sure they do," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I confess I have been curious about how many people in the village entrust their keys to others. It seems to be a more common practice than I had realized." Dr. Haydock considered this as he shifted his medical bag to his other hand. "Oh, quite common, I should think. I know I've left my spare with Mrs. Moore on several occasions when I've been called away unexpectedly. Most convenient, really. She's always so reliable about such things." Mrs. Moore seems to be everyone's choice for such responsibilities, Miss Marple observed mildly. Well, naturally, the doctor said. She's been doing it for years, hasn't she? Started, I believe, back when old Colonel Bantry was alive and needed someone to look in on his sister while he was in London. Mrs. Moore handled it beautifully, and word got round. Now I suppose half the village has handed her a key at one time or another. Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. Half the village? That seems rather a large responsibility. I dare say it does accumulate, Dr. Haydock admitted, though I've never heard of any difficulty arising from it. Mrs. Moore is discretion itself. Never any hint of gossip or interference. She simply does what's needed and says nothing about it. Can't fault that, can you? They parted shortly thereafter, and Miss Marple continued her walk home with rather more to think about than she had anticipated. Half the village, the doctor had said. That suggested that Mrs. Moore held keys to a considerable number of houses, entrusted to her care over the course of many years and for various perfectly legitimate reasons. It was a curious position to be in, Miss Marple reflected, to have access to so many private spaces, so many personal arrangements, so much information about how people lived when they believed themselves to be unobserved. Over the next several days, Miss Marple made it her business to pay attention to the question of keys and trust, though she did so with her customary discretion. A remark here, a casual question there, and a willingness to listen when people wished to talk about their domestic arrangements all contributed to a gradually emerging picture. She learned from Miss Weatherby that Mrs. Moore had held a spare key to the lending library for the past 5 years, having stepped in during an emergency when the regular librarian had fallen ill. The arrangement had simply continued, as these things often did. She discovered from young Mrs. Bartlett, who had recently taken a cottage near the church, that Mrs. Moore had offered to keep a spare key during the young couple's honeymoon trip to Devon, and had thoughtfully watered the plants and collected the post without being asked. She gathered from various sources that Mrs. Moore had keys to the church hall, having served as the treasurer of multiple committees that met there, and that she had at various times held temporary custody of keys belonging to families who were renovating their homes, caring for elderly relatives, or simply away on holiday. What struck Miss Marple most particularly was the way people spoke about these arrangements. There was nothing but praise for Mrs. Moore's helpfulness, her reliability, her discretion, and yet, as the conversations accumulated, a subtle pattern began to emerge. It was always Mrs. Moore who offered to keep the keys. It was always Mrs. Moore who volunteered to check on things, to water plants, to ensure that all was well. And while these offers were invariably welcomed and appreciated, Miss Marple noticed that they were rarely made in response to a direct request. Rather, Mrs. Moore seemed to anticipate the need before it was expressed, offering her assistance with such perfect timing that refusal would have seemed both ungracious and unnecessary. On Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Price walking rather aimlessly near the post office. The thin, nervous woman looked even more uncertain than usual, and when Miss Marple greeted her, she started slightly as though her thoughts had been elsewhere. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her hands fluttering to adjust her hat. "I was just, I was wondering—" She stopped, looking embarrassed. "Is something troubling you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price glanced around as though to ensure they would not be overheard, then said in a lowered voice, "It is probably nothing. Only, I have been thinking about what Mrs. Brockhurst said about the key, and it has made me rather uncomfortable about something." "Would you care to walk a little way with me?" Miss Marple suggested. "I find it so much easier to think clearly when one is moving." They walked slowly along the lane that led past the church, Mrs. Price's agitation gradually settling as she found words for what troubled her. "The thing is," she said at last, "I gave Mrs. Moore a key to my cottage 3 years ago, when I went to visit my sister in Bournemouth. She was kind enough to look after my cat while I was away. When I returned, she gave me back the key, and I thought nothing more of it. But now I find myself wondering whether she might have—" She stopped, looking miserable. "Oh, it sounds so suspicious when I say it aloud. She would have no reason to keep a copy, none at all. And yet I cannot quite shake the feeling that perhaps she did." "What makes you think so?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Price twisted her gloves in her hands. "It is only that sometimes when I return home, small things are not quite where I left them. A cushion moved slightly, a drawer not quite closed. Nothing taken, you understand, nothing disturbed in any obvious way, but just enough to make me wonder whether someone has been in the house. And then I tell myself I am being foolish, that I must have moved those things myself and forgotten, that I am letting my imagination run away with me." "But you're not entirely convinced by your own reassurances," Miss Marple said. "No," Mrs. Price admitted quietly. "I am not." They walked in silence for a moment. A blackbird sang from the hedge, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower hummed its mechanical song. "May I ask," Miss Marple said carefully, "whether you have mentioned these feelings to anyone else?" "Oh no," Mrs. Price said quickly. "I would not dare. People already think me rather foolish and timid. If I were to suggest that Mrs. Moore, of all people, might be entering my home without permission, they would think me quite mad. And perhaps I am. Perhaps I am simply one of those nervous women who sees problems where none exist." Miss Marple stopped walking and looked directly at her companion. "Mrs. Price, I do not think you are foolish at all. I think you are observant, and that is quite a different thing. Observation requires no apology." Mrs. Price looked startled, then grateful. "Do you really think so?" "I do indeed," Miss Marple said firmly, "and I would advise you to continue trusting your observations, while being, as you already are, discreet about sharing them." They parted shortly after, and Miss Marple continued her walk alone. The conversation had been illuminating, not because it proved anything definite, but because it suggested a pattern. Mrs. Brockhurst's certainty about her own memory, Mrs. Price's uncomfortable awareness of small displacements, both women doubting themselves because the alternative seemed too improbable to voice. And yet Miss Marple thought as she reached her gate and paused to examine the progress of her wallflowers. What if the improbable were actually quite simple? What if a person who held many keys and who was trusted by many people had simply grown accustomed to using those keys? Not for any dramatic purpose, not to steal or harm, but merely because the access existed, and because habit, once established, was difficult to break. She had known a scullery maid once, many years ago, who had developed the practice of tasting dishes in the kitchen when the cook's back was turned. Nothing was ever missing, nothing was ever spoiled, but the maid simply could not resist the opportunity to sample what was not quite hers to taste. The habit had been innocent in its origin, yet it had represented a crossing of boundaries that should have remained firm. Keys, Miss Marple reflected, opened more than just doors. They opened possibilities, opportunities, and perhaps most significantly, they opened the space between what was permitted and what was merely possible. The question was not whether Mrs. Moore held many keys. The question was what she had learned to do with them. Chapter 4. Polite explanations offered promptly. The weekend brought with it a spell of genuinely pleasant weather, the sort that encouraged people to linger in their gardens and exchange remarks over hedges that had remained unscalable barriers during the darker months. Miss Marple spent Saturday morning attending to her roses, which were showing promising signs of the season to come, and it was while she was thus occupied that she overheard a conversation that proved illuminating in ways the speakers likely did not intend. Mrs. Clement and Miss Weatherby had stopped on the lane just beyond Miss Marple's garden wall, evidently having encountered each other while on their respective errands. Their voices carried clearly in the still morning air, though Miss Marple suspected they were unaware of her presence behind the climbing roses. "I do think poor Helena is being rather persistent about this key business," Miss Weatherby was saying. "I met her at the butcher's yesterday, and she mentioned that she had been making inquiries about when the key might have been cut. Mr. Fletcher showed her his records apparently, but there was nothing recorded for her address." "Nothing at all?" Mrs. Clement sounded surprised. "But surely that proves the key could not have come from his shop." "One would think so," Miss Weatherby agreed. "But Mr. Fletcher explained that he does not always record every transaction in his ledger, particularly for small jobs or for people he knows well. He suggested that perhaps the key was cut during a busy period, and he simply neglected to make a note of it. These things do happen, after all. There was a pause, during which Miss Marple carefully pruned a recalcitrant stem and maintained her position of interested invisibility. "Well, I suppose that is a reasonable explanation," Mrs. Clement said, though she did not sound entirely convinced. "Though I must say it seems rather careless of Mr. Fletcher." Mrs. Moore said the same thing, though when I mentioned it to her this morning, Miss Weatherby replied. She was quite understanding about Helena's concerns, but she did point out that sometimes we must accept that not everything can be explained to our complete satisfaction. She suggested that Helena might be better served by simply having her locks changed, if she feels uneasy, rather than troubling herself with trying to solve an insoluble puzzle. "That does sound like sensible advice," Mrs. Clement conceded. "Mrs. Moore is always so practical about these matters." The conversation drifted to other topics after that, and the two ladies eventually continued on their way. Miss Marple remained among her roses for some time longer, considering what she had heard. It was interesting, she reflected, how quickly explanations had materialized for each development in the matter. The key could not be traced in Mr. Fletcher's records, and so it was suggested that record-keeping might have been lax. Mrs. Brockhurst wished to understand how the key came to exist, and so it was proposed that understanding might be impossible and ought to be abandoned. Each obstacle to clarity was met with a prompt rationalization, and each rationalization had the effect of discouraging further inquiry. Most interesting of all was the fact that Mrs. Moore appeared to be consistently present in these explanatory conversations, offering her practical wisdom at precisely the moments when doubt might otherwise flourish. Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and went indoors to wash her hands, her mind occupied with the question of how one might distinguish between genuine helpfulness and something rather more calculated. The difficulty, she recognized, was that truly helpful people and those who wished to control the flow of information often behaved in remarkably similar ways. Both offered reassurance, both provided explanations, and both worked to smooth over difficulties before they could develop into larger problems. The distinction lay not in the actions themselves, but in the subtle matter of timing and necessity. On Sunday afternoon, following morning service at the church, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with young Mrs. Bartlett, who had been so grateful for Mrs. Moore's assistance during her honeymoon. The young woman was cheerful and friendly, and she spoke with genuine warmth about the kindness she'd received from various village residents. "Everyone has been so welcoming," Mrs. Bartlett said as they walked slowly toward the lich gate. "Particularly Mrs. Moore. She has been absolutely wonderful about helping us settle in. She even noticed that our pantry door was sticking and arranged for Mr. Parsons to come and plane it down, all without our having to ask." "How very thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "Though I confess I am curious how she came to notice the difficulty with your pantry door." Mrs. Bartlett laughed. "Oh, she was returning our key after our trip to Devon, and she mentioned that she had checked the house once or twice to make sure everything was all right. She noticed the door then, I suppose. We had mentioned it was sticking before we left, you see, and I imagine she remembered." "I see," Miss Marple said gently. "And she was able to arrange for the repair?" "Yes, she knows everyone, doesn't she? She simply spoke to Mr. Parsons, and he came round the very next day. We were so grateful. We would have got around to it ourselves eventually. But these things do slip one's mind when one is busy unpacking and settling in." They parted at the gate, and Miss Marple continued her walk home with a thoughtful expression. The incident was innocent enough on its surface, a helpful neighbour noticing a problem and arranging for its solution. And yet it meant that Mrs. Moore had entered the Bartletts' house during their absence, not merely to collect post or water plants as had been requested, but to conduct what amounted to an inspection of the premises. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting and allowed her mind to range over various incidents from the past. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for many years, and she had observed the gradual evolution of Mrs. Moore's role in village life. The woman had indeed been helpful following Colonel Bantry's difficulties with his sister, as Dr. Haydock had mentioned. but Miss Marple now recalled that there had been some quiet discussion at the time about how Mrs. Moore had come to know of the situation in the first place, and how she had managed to involve herself before the Colonel had quite realised he needed assistance. There had been other incidents too, now that she considered them with fresh attention. A neighbour's family dispute that Mrs. Moore had somehow learned about and helped to resolve. A question about property boundaries that she had clarified by producing documents that no one had known she possessed. Small matters, all of them, and all resolved satisfactorily. But each resolution had depended upon Mrs. Moore knowing things that she ought not, strictly speaking, to have known. Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Price's uncomfortable observation that small things in her cottage were occasionally displaced. She thought about young Mrs. Bartlett's gratitude for assistance she had not requested. She thought about Mrs. Brockhurst's certainty that she had not commissioned a spare key, and about how quickly that certainty had been reinterpreted as forgetfulness or strain. A pattern was emerging, though it was a subtle one. Mrs. Moore moved through the village collecting information, noticing details and positioning herself to be indispensable. She held keys that gave her access to private spaces, and she appeared to use that access not for theft or obvious harm, but simply to know things, to understand situations before others realised they were situations that required understanding. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a form of power that was all the more effective for being almost invisible. Mrs. Moore's authority rested not on any official position, but on the quiet accumulation of knowledge and the strategic offering of help. People trusted her because she was useful, and she remained useful because people trusted her with access to their homes and, by extension, to their private lives. The question that remained was what Mrs. Moore did with all that she learned. Was she merely satisfying a natural curiosity? Was she genuinely motivated by a desire to help? Or was there something else at work, some need to maintain a particular position within the village's social structure? Miss Marple recalled a governess she had known many years ago, a woman who had made herself invaluable to a family by anticipating their needs and solving their problems before they fully materialised. It had taken some time before anyone realised that the governess had been creating certain of those problems herself, not out of malice, but out of the desperate fear that she might no longer be needed. The woman had been so deeply invested in her role as indispensable helper that she could not bear the thought of being dispensed with. Was it possible, Miss Marple wondered, that Mrs. Moore had fallen into a similar pattern? That she had grown so accustomed to being useful, so dependent on being needed, that she had begun to seek out opportunities for intervention rather than waiting for them to arise naturally? The thought was not a comfortable one, for it suggested that Mrs. Moore's helpfulness might have crossed an invisible line from service to intrusion, from assistance to interference. And if that were the case, then the second key was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of something larger, a habit of access that had grown gradually over time until it had become simply the way things were done. Miss Marple set down her knitting and went indoors to make tea, her mind still occupied with these uncomfortable possibilities. She had no proof, of course. Everything she had observed could be explained innocently. Mrs. Moore might genuinely be nothing more than a helpful neighbour who occasionally overstepped in her eagerness to assist. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that human nature revealed itself most clearly not in dramatic moments, but in the small, repeated patterns of daily behaviour, and the pattern she was observing suggested that Mrs. Moore had stopped asking permission some time ago, preferring instead to act on what she believed to be in everyone's best interests. The difficulty with that approach, Miss Marple reflected as she poured her tea, was that it required one person to decide what constituted everyone's best interests, and that was a responsibility that no one, however well-intentioned, ought to assume without invitation. She returned to her garden with her teacup and sat watching the late afternoon sun illuminate her flower beds. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells chimed the hour. A cat stalked through the hedge, intent on some private business. The village continued its peaceful routines, unaware that beneath the surface of orderly daily life, questions were accumulating. Miss Marple took up her knitting once more and reflected that truth, like spring growth, often took its time in revealing itself, but reveal itself it would, given sufficient patience and attention. All one had to do was watch and wait and notice the small things that others preferred to explain away. Chapter 5. The Comfort of Blaming Carelessness. By Monday morning, the matter of Mrs. Brockhurst's mysterious key had acquired what Miss Marple privately thought of as a settled quality. This was not to say that the mystery had been solved, but rather that the village had reached a comfortable consensus about how the matter ought to be understood, and more particularly how it ought to be discussed. The consensus, which Miss Marple heard articulated in various forms throughout the week, was that Mrs. Brockhurst had almost certainly commissioned the key herself during some period of distraction or illness, and had then forgotten about it entirely. This explanation had the virtue of being both charitable and convenient. It absolved everyone of any need for concern while gently suggesting that Mrs. Brockhurst might benefit from paying closer attention to her affairs. Miss Marple encountered this explanation in its most polished form on Monday afternoon when she stopped at the draper's to purchase thread and found herself in conversation with Mrs. Palmer, the shopkeeper's wife, and Miss Hartley, a retired schoolmistress who lived in one of the cottages near the railway station. "Such a relief that the whole business has been cleared up," Mrs. Palmer said as she measured out the thread with practised efficiency, "though I must say it gave us all rather a turn at first. The idea of unauthorised keys circulating about the village was most unsettling." "But there were no unauthorised keys, were there?" Miss Hartley said firmly. She was a woman of decided opinions and considerable intelligence, and she clearly had little patience for unnecessary alarm. "The key was commissioned legitimately, paid for, and then simply forgotten. These things happen, particularly as one gets older. I myself have occasionally misplaced items and then convinced myself they were never mine to begin with." "That is very true," Mrs. Palmer agreed. "My own mother became quite forgetful in her later years. It was most distressing for her, though we learned to manage it with patience and understanding." Miss Marple accepted her thread and made a small neutral sound that could be interpreted as agreement. She noticed that Mrs. Brockhurst, who was not yet 60, and who had shown no previous signs of mental decline, had somehow been transformed into an object of gentle concern rather than a person with a legitimate grievance. "I understand Mrs. Brockhurst has been asking questions at the post office," Miss Hartley continued. "Apparently she wanted to know whether anyone had seen Mrs. Moore with an unusual number of keys. Mrs. Deacon told her very sensibly that Mrs. Moore carries keys for half a dozen different organisations, and that it would be impossible to say what was usual or unusual." "Mrs. Moore has been very patient about the whole thing," Mrs. Palmer observed. "I saw her on Saturday, and she said she hoped Helena would soon feel more settled about it all. She suggested that perhaps a brief holiday might do her good, help her to put the matter in perspective." Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind occupied not with what had been said, but with what had been accomplished by the saying of it. In the space of less than a week, Mrs. Brockhurst's concern had been redefined from a potentially significant discovery to a minor domestic confusion brought on by age and inattention. The village had effectively closed ranks around an explanation that required no further investigation and implicitly discouraged any attempt to pursue one. What struck Miss Marple most particularly was how this consensus had been achieved without any obvious orchestration. No one had issued a directive or announced a conclusion. Instead, small conversations had accumulated, each one reinforcing the same general interpretation, until doubt had been smoothly transformed into certainty. And yet, when one examined these conversations carefully, one often found that Mrs. Moore had been present at some point in their development, offering a word here, a suggestion there, always reasonable and never insistent. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Brockhurst arrived just as the light was beginning to fade, looking tired and considerably more strained than she had during her previous visit. "I hope I am not intruding," she said as Gladys showed her into the sitting room. "I know it is rather late for calling, but I felt I must speak with someone who might understand." "You're always welcome," Miss Marple assured her, setting aside her knitting. Please sit down. You look as though you could use some tea." Mrs. Brockhurst accepted gratefully, and for a few moments they sat in companionable silence while the tea was prepared and peered. Miss Marple did not press her visitor to speak, having learned long ago that people often needed time to arrange their thoughts before giving them voice. "I have begun to feel," Mrs. Brockhurst said at last, "as though I am fighting against something I cannot quite see. Everyone is so kind, so reasonable, so eager to reassure me that there is nothing to worry about. And yet I am left with a distinct impression that I am being encouraged not to worry precisely because there is something that ought not to be examined too closely." "That is a perceptive observation," Miss Marple said quietly. "Is it?" Mrs. Brockhurst looked almost relieved. "I had begun to wonder whether I was simply being obstinate. Miss Hartley mentioned today that I seem to be making rather a production of a simple misunderstanding, and Mrs. Moore has been so solicitous about my well-being that I cannot help but feel I am disappointing her by continuing to ask questions. May I ask what questions you have been asking?" Mrs. Brockhurst set down her teacup with a small, decisive gesture. "I have been trying to establish exactly when the key might have been cut. Mr. Fletcher insists he has no record of it, but he cannot say with certainty that it did not come from his shop. I have spoken to his assistant, who remembers nothing. I have checked my own records and accounts, and I can find no payment for a key at any point in the past 7 years. I have even inquired at the locksmith in Much Benham, thinking perhaps I had gone there instead, but they have no record either. And what conclusion do you draw from these investigations?" "That either I am losing my mind," Mrs. Brockhurst said with grim humour, "or that someone had a key cut without my knowledge or authorization. But whenever I come close to saying as much, I am met with such kind concern about my stress levels and my tendency to overwork that I begin to doubt my own sanity." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on her knitting. "May I share with you an observation that I have made over many years of living in villages such as this?" "Please do." "I have noticed," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there are two distinct ways in which communities respond to uncomfortable truths. Sometimes they confront them directly despite the difficulty and disruption this may cause, but more often, particularly in places where social harmony is highly valued, they choose instead to reinterpret the uncomfortable truth as something more manageable. A mystery becomes a misunderstanding. A violation becomes a mistake. And the person who insists on preserving the original interpretation is gently encouraged to reconsider for the sake of everyone's peace of mind." Mrs. Brockhurst leaned forward slightly. "You're saying that I am not imagining this pressure to accept a convenient explanation?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, "that you're experiencing something that is quite common. When an individual's legitimate concern threatens to disrupt the established social order. The village prefers to believe that you have forgotten commissioning a key because the alternative is to believe that someone in the village has behaved in a way that requires investigation and possibly confrontation. The first belief requires nothing of anyone except patience with your supposed confusion. The second belief requires a great deal of everyone, and most people will avoid such requirements if given any reasonable excuse to do so." "But what should I do?" Mrs. Brockhurst asked. "I cannot simply accept an explanation I know to be false." "Nor should you," Miss Marple said firmly. "However, I would counsel discretion in how you proceed. You have asked your questions, and you have found no satisfactory answers through direct inquiry. Perhaps it is time to step back and allow the matter to develop in its own way. Sometimes truth reveals itself not through our pushing toward it, but through our paying attention when it chooses to emerge." Mrs. Brockhurst looked uncertain but somewhat comforted. "You make it sound as though truth has a will of its own. In a sense, perhaps it does," Miss Marple said. "Or rather, people who are keeping secrets have a tendency to make small mistakes, particularly when they believe they have successfully discouraged investigation. If you continue to appear troubled, they will continue to work at reassuring you. But if you seem to accept their reassurances, they may relax their guard. And that is often when the truth becomes visible." They spoke for a while longer about other matters, and when Mrs. Brockhurst left, she seemed less agitated, though no less determined. Miss Marple watched her walk down the path in the gathering dusk and reflected that determination could be a double-edged quality. It could sustain one through difficulty, but it could also make one vulnerable to manipulation. She returned to her sitting room and took up her knitting once more, though her mind was not on the stitches. The village had successfully blamed carelessness for the existence of the second key, and in doing so had closed off any legitimate avenue of inquiry. It was a neat solution, and one that had been achieved with remarkable efficiency. The question was whether Mrs. Brockhurst would allow herself to be satisfied with it. Miss Marple rather thought she would not, and that presented its own complications. A person who continued to ask uncomfortable questions after the village had decided those questions were unnecessary might find herself increasingly isolated, increasingly dismissed as difficult or unreasonable. It was a form of pressure that was all the more effective for being almost entirely invisible. No one was being unkind to Mrs. Brockhurst. No one was refusing to listen to her concerns. Everyone was simply being so very understanding about her confusion, so very patient with her distress, that the underlying message became inescapable. The problem was not with the facts, but with her interpretation of them. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to close the curtains against the night. Beyond her garden wall, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening routines. Lights appeared in windows, a dog barked briefly, someone walked past, their footsteps measured and unhurried. All perfectly ordinary, all exactly as it should be. And yet, Miss Marple thought as she returned to her chair, ordinariness could be the most effective disguise of all. When everyone agreed that nothing unusual was happening, it became extraordinarily difficult to insist otherwise without appearing unreasonable. But Mrs. Brockhurst was not being unreasonable. She was being accurate. And accuracy, Miss Marple had found, had a way of prevailing in the end, provided one had sufficient patience to wait for the right moment to assert it. Chapter 6. Who benefited from access. The first week of May arrived with a burst of unseasonably warm weather that sent everyone into their gardens with renewed purpose. Miss Marple spent Wednesday morning attending to her vegetable plot, which required careful attention if it was to produce the summer crops she relied upon. It was pleasant work, methodical and absorbing, and it allowed her mind to occupy itself with questions that had been accumulating quietly over the past fortnight. She had been thinking a great deal about the nature of benefit. When something occurred that seemed irregular or troubling, one of the most reliable approaches was to consider who gained advantage from the situation, not necessarily through theft or obvious wrongdoing, but through the quiet occurrences of knowledge, influence, and position. Mrs. Moore had access to many homes in St. Mary Mead. That much was established. But what did that access provide beyond the practical convenience of watering plants or collecting post? What might a person learn by moving through private spaces when the inhabitants were absent? And more significantly, what might they do with such knowledge? Miss Marple was still pondering these questions when she received a visit that afternoon from Dr. Haydock, who had stopped by ostensibly to check on a slight cough she had mentioned the previous week, but which she suspected was more about satisfying his curiosity than addressing any medical concern. "You're looking well," he announced after a brief examination that consisted primarily of listening to her breathe and inquiring about her sleep. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The village could use more people with your constitution." "I shall endeavour to continue being adequately healthy," Miss Marple said with gentle amusement. "Will you stay for tea?" The doctor accepted readily, settling himself into the armchair, with the air of a man who had time to spare and conversation on his mind. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began, "about keys and trust. It struck me as an interesting observation, particularly in light of the Brockhurst business, though I gather that's all been sorted now." "Has it?" Miss Marple asked as she poured tea. "Well, Helena seems to have accepted that she must have forgotten about having the key made," Dr. Haydock said. "Saw her yesterday, and she seemed much calmer, said she'd decided not to trouble herself further about it." "I see," Miss Marple said neutrally. "That must be a relief to everyone." The doctor gave her a sharp look. You don't sound entirely convinced." "I am not entirely convinced," Miss Marple admitted, "though I confess my doubts are based more on observation than on any concrete evidence. Tell me, de Haydock, in your years of attending to the village, have you noticed Mrs. Moore taking a particular interest in people's private affairs?" Dr. Haydock stirred his tea thoughtfully. That's a rather pointed question. What sort of interest do you mean?" "The sort that goes beyond normal neighbourly concern," Miss Marple said carefully. "The sort that suggests someone has access to information they ought not to have." The doctor was silent for a long moment, his expression growing more serious. "It's curious you should mention that," he said at last. "I've had an odd feeling once or twice that Mrs. Moore knew things about my patients that I hadn't shared with anyone. Nothing dramatic, you understand, just small details that suggested she had more knowledge of their circumstances than seemed quite natural. Can you give me an example?" "Last autumn," Dr. Haydock said slowly, "I was treating old Mrs. Fortescue for a recurring complaint. She lived alone, you'll remember, and was rather proud of her independence. I mentioned to no one except my wife that I was concerned about her taking her medication properly, as she had a tendency to forget. Yet when I called on Mrs. Fortescue a few days later, Mrs. Moore had already been to see her and had organised a rather elaborate system for ensuring the medication was taken at the right times. When I asked Mrs. Fortescue how Mrs. Moore had known to do this, she seemed vague about it. Said Mrs. Moore had simply stopped by and noticed the medication bottles and took it upon herself to help." "And you found that surprising?" "I found it oddly convenient," Dr. Haydock said. "Mrs. Moore has a key to Mrs. Fortescue's cottage, of course. Had it for years since Mrs. Fortescue's daughter moved to Cornwall. And Mrs. Fortescue keeps her medication in a cupboard in the kitchen, not somewhere that would be immediately visible to a casual visitor." Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly. "What did you conclude from the incident?" "At the time, nothing particular. I was simply grateful that the problem had been addressed. But now that you raise the question, it does suggest that Mrs. Moore may have been in Mrs. Fortescue's house when the old lady was out, noticed the medication, and drawn her own conclusions about the proper course of action." "Without being asked." "Without being asked," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "Though one could argue she was being admirably proactive." "One could indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though one might also observe that entering someone's home without their knowledge, even with good intentions, represents a rather significant overstepping of boundaries." The doctor shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable. "I suppose it does when you put it that way, though I must say Mrs. Moore has never been anything but helpful. If she has used her access to people's homes, it's always been in their best interests." "Has it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or has it been in what she believes to be their best interests? There is rather a significant difference." De Haydock had no ready answer to that, and after a moment he changed the subject to other matters. But after he had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time thinking about what he had revealed. Mrs. Fortescue's medication, the Bartlett sticking pantry door, Mrs. Price's occasionally displaced belongings. Each incident suggested that Mrs. Moore had been entering homes she had keys to, not merely for the stated purposes of plant watering or post-collection, but to observe, to assess, and occasionally to intervene. The pattern was becoming clearer, though it remained subtle. Mrs. Moore had positioned herself as indispensable not through any dramatic actions, but through the steady accumulation of small interventions. She noticed things before they became problems. She solved difficulties before people realized they needed solving. She knew what was happening in people's lives before they mentioned it to anyone. And all of this required access. Physical access to their homes, and through that access, knowledge of their private circumstances. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, looking out at her garden where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flower beds. She thought about Mrs. Brockhurst's recent decision to change her will, mentioned only to Mrs. Moore. Had that been what prompted the discovery of the key? Had Mrs. Brockhurst perhaps begun to feel that her privacy was being compromised in a way she could not quite articulate, and had the will represented an attempt to reclaim some measure of independence? It would explain why Mrs. Moore had been so quick to reassure everyone that the key matter was insignificant. If Mrs. Brockhurst had been on the verge of recognizing that her trusted helper had been taking liberties with her trust, it would have been essential to smooth the matter over before it could develop into a larger realization. Miss Marple remembered something her nephew Raymond had once said about how white-collar criminals were often caught. It was not usually through the discovery of a single dramatic theft, but through the gradual recognition of small, repeated irregularities. Someone noticed that paperwork went missing and reappeared. Someone else observed that certain records seemed to have been accessed without authorization. Eventually, these observations accumulated into a pattern, and the pattern revealed the truth. The second key was such an irregularity, not dramatic in itself, but suggestive of a pattern that had been operating unnoticed for years. The question was how to address it. Mrs. Moore had broken no obvious laws. She had stolen nothing, harmed no one directly, and had in many cases actually helped people manage their affairs more effectively. Her interventions had been benign in their outcomes, even if they had been unauthorized in their execution. And yet there was something deeply troubling about the situation. Mrs. Moore had made herself essential to the village's functioning, but she had done so by quietly eroding the boundaries between public service and private intrusion. She knew things she ought not to know. She entered spaces she had not been invited to enter. She made decisions about other people's lives based on information she had obtained, without their knowledge or consent. It was a violation of trust, even if it had been conducted with the very best of intentions. Miss Marple turned from the window and went to her writing desk, where she kept a small diary of observations. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote a single question. What happens when someone mistakes usefulness for permission? Then she added, after a moment's thought, and what happens when the village realizes that their helper has been helping herself to access she was never quite granted? She closed the diary and returned it to its drawer. The answer to those questions she suspected would emerge in its own time. Mrs. Brockhurst's decision to apparently accept the convenient explanation would not, Miss Marple felt certain, prove to be the end of the matter. People who had been violated, even gently, had a way of returning to their grievances once they had time to consider them properly. And Mrs. Brockhurst struck Miss Marple as a woman of considerable intelligence and determination. The matter was not settled. It was merely suspended, waiting for the right moment to reassert itself. Miss Marple found that she was rather looking forward to seeing what that moment might reveal. Chapter 7. A Favour That Became a Habit. The village fete committee met on Friday afternoon in the church hall, and Miss Marple, who served as secretary, arrived promptly with her notebook and her customary quiet attention to detail. The fete was scheduled for early June, and there were numerous arrangements to be finalised regarding stalls, entertainments, and the allocation of responsibilities. Mrs. Moore was naturally present. She had volunteered to coordinate the White Elephant stall and had already collected a considerable quantity of donations from various households. She reported on this progress with her usual efficiency, noting which items had been promised, which had already been delivered, and which required collection. "I shall need to visit Mrs. Thornton tomorrow to collect the china tea set she mentioned," Mrs. Moore said, consulting her own notes. "And Colonel Melchett has several boxes of books that want sorting. I have his key, of course, so I can let myself in and bring them here directly without troubling him. He did say he would be out most of the day attending to business in town." "That's very good of you," Mrs. Clement said warmly. "The Colonel can be quite particular about his time, and I'm sure he appreciates not having to arrange to be home for the collection." Miss Marple made a note in her book, though her attention was not primarily on the White Elephant arrangements. She was thinking instead about how casually Mrs. Moore had mentioned having the Colonel's key, and how natural everyone found it that she should let herself into his house during his absence. It was, she reflected, rather remarkable how a practice that might once have seemed presumptuous had become, so through repetition and familiarity, simply the way things were done. No one questioned Mrs. Moore's possession of keys or her use of them. It had become part of the village's normal functioning, as unremarkable as the postman's rounds or the milkman's deliveries. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple found herself walking back toward the village green in company with Miss Hartley, who had attended the meeting in her capacity as organiser of the bookstall. "Mrs. Moore is quite invaluable, isn't she?" Miss Hartley observed. "I don't know how we managed before she began helping with everything, though I suppose it has been so long now that one can hardly remember a time when she wasn't involved." "How long has it been, would you say?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Hartley considered. "Oh, it must be at least 10 years, perhaps 12. She began helping with the Church Restoration Fund, I believe, after her husband died. Dr. Haydock suggested at the time that it might be good for her to have occupation, and she certainly threw herself into village life with admirable energy." "And the keys?" Miss Marple ventured. "When did that aspect of her helpfulness begin?" "Let me think." Miss Hartley paused at the corner, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I believe it started with the Colonel Bantry situation. You remember old Colonel Bantry? He died, it must be 7 or 8 years ago now. His sister was staying with him at the time, recovering from an illness, and there was some difficulty about managing the household. Mrs. Moore offered to help, and the Colonel gave her a key so that she could come and go as needed. It all worked out remarkably well, and I think word simply spread from there." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And after Colonel Bantry passed away?" "Well, by then Mrs. Moore had proven herself so reliable that people naturally continued to turn to her when they needed assistance. It seemed foolish to keep troubling her to return keys when she might need them again for some future occasion. More efficient to simply let her keep them." They parted at the green, and Miss Marple continued homeward alone, her mind occupied with what she had learned. The pattern had begun with a genuine need. Colonel Bantry's sister had required help and Mrs. Moore had provided it. But somewhere in the years that followed, the practice had evolved from occasional assistance into something more systematic. Mrs. Moore had not merely helped when asked. She had positioned herself to be the person one asked, and eventually the person one didn't need to ask, because she had already anticipated the need. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like a story her great-aunt had told her many years ago, about a housekeeper who had begun by helping an elderly employer with correspondence, and had ended by effectively managing all of the employer's affairs. There had been no malice in it, no theft, but gradually the employer had lost agency over her own life, becoming dependent on the housekeeper's judgment for even the smallest decisions. When the situation had finally been recognised for what it was, the employer had been too frail and too accustomed to deferring to the housekeeper to reclaim her independence. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected piece of information from her maid, Gladys, who had been shopping in the village and had heard something that troubled her sufficiently to mention it. "I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, Miss Marple," Gladys said as she cleared away the supper dishes, "but I heard something today that seemed odd, and I thought you might want to know about it." "Please tell me," Miss Marple encouraged. "Well, I was at the baker's this afternoon, and Mrs. Dobbs was there. She's Mrs. Brockhurst's cleaning woman, you know, and she was talking to Mrs. Price. Mrs. Dobbs said that Mrs. Brockhurst had been asking her questions about when Mrs. Moore had returned that key, wanted to know exactly when it had happened, and whether Mrs. Moore had said anything particular about where it came from or why she had it." "And what did Mrs. Dobbs say?" "She said it had been about 3 weeks ago, just before Mrs. Brockhurst discovered the whole business. Mrs. Moore had brought the key round one morning when Mrs. Brockhurst was out, handed it to Mrs. Dobbs, and said Mr. Fletcher had found it and asked her to return it. Mrs. Dobbs thought nothing of it at the time, but now she's wondering whether there was something strange about the timing." "Strange in what way?" Gladys hesitated, then said carefully, "Mrs. Dobbs mentioned that Mrs. Brockhurst had been talking about making changes to her will just a few days before the key business started. She'd mentioned it to Mrs. Moore, apparently, saying she wanted to leave some money to her niece in Canada and make sure her affairs were more independent. Mrs. Dobbs heard them talking about it when she was cleaning upstairs." Miss Marple sat very still. "I see. And Mrs. Dobbs found this significant?" "She said it just seemed odd that the key appeared right after Mrs. Brockhurst had been talking about wanting more independence. Made her wonder whether someone didn't want Mrs. Brockhurst getting too independent, if you see what I mean." Miss Marple saw exactly what she meant. The timeline was suggestive. Mrs. Brockhurst had expressed a desire for greater autonomy in managing her affairs, and shortly thereafter a key had surfaced that reminded her, and everyone else, that her privacy might not be as secure as she had believed. The effect had been to unsettle her, to make her question her own memory and judgment, and ultimately to make her more rather than less dependent on the reassurance and guidance of others. Most particularly on the reassurance and guidance of Mrs. Moore. It was a subtle form of control, and all the more effective for being exercised through kindness rather than coercion. By creating doubt about Mrs. Brockhurst's mental clarity, by positioning herself as the calm voice of reason, Mrs. Moore had essentially discouraged any movement toward independence, while appearing to do nothing more than offer support. "Thank you for telling me." "Thank you for Gladys," Miss Marple said. "I think you were quite right to mention it." After Gladys had gone, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, her knitting lying untouched in her lap. The picture was becoming clearer, though it remained incomplete. Mrs. Moore had begun with a genuine impulse to help, but over time that impulse had transformed into something else, a need to be needed perhaps, or a desire to maintain a particular position within the village's social structure. What had started as a favour had become a habit, and the habit had gradually eroded the distinction between assistance and interference. Mrs. Moore had grown accustomed to having access, to knowing things, to making decisions on behalf of others. And when someone like Mrs. Brockhurst had begun to assert independence, that habit had been threatened. The second key, Miss Marple now suspected, had not been forgotten by Mrs. Brockhurst. It had been made by Mrs. Moore herself at some point in the past when she had found it convenient to have unrestricted access to Mrs. Brockhurst's house. The key had existed quietly for months or perhaps years, unused but available. And when Mr. Fletcher had happened across it during his shop tidying, perhaps having cut it at Mrs. Moore's request and then misfiled it, the whole arrangement had been exposed. Mrs. Moore had returned the key, but only after ensuring that its discovery would seem like Mrs. Brockhurst's confusion rather than her own overreach. It was clever in its way, and it might have worked, had Mrs. Brockhurst been a more biddable sort of person, or had Miss Marple not been paying attention to the small details that others overlooked. But Mrs. Brockhurst was not biddable, and Miss Marple was always paying attention. The question now was what ought to be done about it. Mrs. Moore had violated trust, certainly, but she had done so in ways that were difficult to prove, and that might seem to many people like mere helpfulness taken slightly too far. The village valued harmony and would be reluctant to disrupt it over what might be characterized as a minor misunderstanding. Miss Marple rose and went to the window, looking out at the peaceful evening scene. A cat prowled along the garden wall. The church clock struck the hour. Everything appeared exactly as it should. But appearances, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, could be profoundly deceiving. She would need to speak with Mrs. Moore soon, not to accuse but to understand, and perhaps, in understanding, to help the woman recognize what her kindness had become. Chapter 8. The Cost of Always Being Trusted. Saturday morning brought rain, the soft, persistent sort that settled in for the duration and transformed the village into a watercolour study of greys and greens. Miss Marple spent the early hours indoors, attending to correspondence and household matters, but by mid-morning she found herself thinking again about Mrs. Moore and the peculiar position she had created for herself. It occurred to Miss Marple that she had been approaching the situation primarily from the perspective of those who had been affected by Mrs. Moore's actions. But there was another perspective to consider, that of Mrs. Moore herself. What did it cost a person to maintain such a carefully constructed role? What pressures accumulated when one's value in the community depended upon being perpetually useful, perpetually available, perpetually trusted? Miss Marple had known other women who had defined themselves entirely through service to others. There had been a district nurse in her youth, a Miss Patterson, who had been so devoted to her patients that she had lost all sense of boundaries between professional duty and personal intrusion. She had entered sick rooms uninvited, made decisions about treatment without consulting doctors, and eventually become so convinced of her own indispensability that she could not recognise when her help had become hindrance. The end of Miss Patterson's career had been sad rather than dramatic. She had simply been asked very gently to retire, and she had done so with bewilderment rather than anger, never quite understanding what she had done wrong. Was Mrs. Moore following a similar path? Had her need to be useful transformed imperceptibly into a need to be essential? And if so, what might happen when that position was threatened? These questions were still occupying Miss Marple's thoughts when she received a visitor just after noon. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Moore herself, looking rather less composed than usual. Her hat was slightly askew from the rain, and there was a tension about her mouth that suggested she had not slept particularly well. "Miss Marple," she said as Gladys showed her into the sitting room, "I hope I am not intruding. I know one ought not to call without invitation on a Saturday, but I find myself rather in need of advice, and you have always seemed to me a person of considerable wisdom." "Please, sit down," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting. "You look troubled. May I offer you some tea?" Mrs. Moore accepted, and for a few moments they occupied themselves with the comfortable ritual of tea preparation. Miss Marple observed that her visitor's hands were not quite steady as she accepted the cup, and that she seemed to be gathering her thoughts with some difficulty. "I have been finding things rather difficult of late," Mrs. Moore began at last. "Not in any dramatic way, you understand, nothing that I can point to and say definitively is wrong, but there has been a feeling, a sense that people are viewing me differently, perhaps questioning things that were previously accepted without thought." "The matter of Mrs. Brockhurst's key?" Miss Marple suggested gently. "Yes." Mrs. Moore looked relieved to have the subject named. "Though it is not merely that, the key business has seemed to open questions about other matters as well. I have sensed a certain wariness in people's manner toward me. Small things, but noticeable. Mrs. Thornton mentioned yesterday that she would deliver her donations to the church hall herself, rather than have me collect them, though I have always collected donations in the past. And Colonel Melchett sent a note saying he would bring his books to the fete directly, despite having previously arranged for me to collect them with the key he'd given me." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And this troubles you?" "It does," Mrs. Moore admitted. "Not because I mind the extra trouble being saved, but because it suggests that people no longer feel comfortable with arrangements that have existed for years. It makes me wonder whether I have somehow given offence without realising it." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, considering how best to proceed. There was genuine distress in Mrs. Moore's voice, and beneath it a confusion that seemed sincere. It would be easy to be harsh, to point out the violations of trust and the overstepping of boundaries, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that understanding was generally more productive than condemnation. "Mrs. Moore," she said carefully, "may I ask you something rather direct? When you have keys to people's homes, do you use them only for the specific purposes they were given to you?" Mrs. Moore looked startled by the question. I use them when I believe it would be helpful, if I notice something that needs attending to, or if I think someone might benefit from a small intervention. Nothing improper, of course, simply the sorts of things a good neighbour might do." "But do you inform people when you have entered their homes for these additional purposes?" There was a long pause. Mrs. Moore set down her teacup with a small, careful movement, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter. "Not always. I had not thought it necessary. I was helping after all, and I did not wish to trouble people with explanations of small kindnesses." "Small kindnesses that required you to be in their homes when they were absent and unaware of your presence," Miss Marple said, still gently, but with unmistakable clarity. Mrs. Moore's face had gone pale. "When you put it that way, it sounds rather different from how I have thought of it." "That," Miss Marple said, "is precisely the difficulty. You have been thinking of your actions as helpfulness, and in many cases they have been helpful. But they have also been something else, an assumption of authority over other people's private spaces and, by extension, over their private lives. You've been making decisions on their behalf without their knowledge or consent, and while your intentions have been good, the practice itself represents a violation of trust." Mrs. Moore sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I had not seen it in that light," she said at last. "I thought I was being useful. I thought people valued what I did for them." "They did value it," Miss Marple assured her. "But there is a difference between being asked to help and taking it upon oneself to determine what help is needed. The first respects people's autonomy. The second, however well-intentioned, erodes it." "But how did it happen?" Mrs. Moore asked, and there was something almost pleading in her voice. "I never meant to overstep. I began simply by trying to be a good neighbour, to do what was needed. When did that become something else?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression kind but serious. "I suspect it happened gradually, as these things often do. You helped Colonel Bantry's sister, and it went well. You were thanked and appreciated. That felt good, naturally, and so you looked for other opportunities to be helpful. Each time you succeeded, it reinforced your sense of being valuable to the community. And somewhere along the way, being helpful became being necessary. You stopped waiting to be asked and began anticipating needs before they were expressed. You stopped merely assisting and began managing. And the keys..." Mrs. Moore's voice was barely above a whisper. "The keys gave you access," Miss Marple said simply. "And access, once granted for a specific purpose, became in your mind permission for broader intervention. You convinced yourself that because people trusted you with their keys, they had implicitly trusted you with their private affairs. But that was not what they had agreed to, Mrs. Moore. They had agreed to let you water their plants or collect their post. They had not agreed to let you observe their habits, assess their needs, and make decisions about their lives without their knowledge." Mrs. Moore was silent for a long time, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I genuinely believed I was helping. I genuinely thought I was doing good." "I believe that you did," Miss Marple said with compassion. "And that is what makes this situation so difficult. You're not a malicious person, Mrs. Moore. You're not someone who set out to harm or control others. But good intentions do not excuse the crossing of boundaries, and believing oneself to be helpful does not make uninvited intervention acceptable." "What should I do?" Mrs. Moore asked, and she sounded suddenly lost, as though a foundation she had built her life upon had crumbled beneath her feet. "You should begin," Miss Marple said gently, "by recognizing what has happened and accepting responsibility for it. Not with dramatic gestures or public confessions, but with quiet acknowledgement to yourself and to those you have affected. You should return the keys you hold, explaining simply that you feel it would be better for everyone if these arrangements were reconsidered. And you should find ways to be helpful that do not require access to people's private spaces or knowledge of their private affairs. But what if people no longer want my help at all?" "Then you will need to accept that," Miss Marple said. "Trust, once damaged, takes time to repair, but I do not think you will find people entirely unwilling to accept your help, provided it is offered properly and with respect for their boundaries. The village has valued your contributions, Mrs. Moore. What they have not valued, what they cannot accept, is the assumption that being helpful gives you the right to be intrusive." Mrs. Moore nodded slowly, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "I have made such a terrible mistake," she whispered, "and I did not even realize I was making it. That," Miss Marple said softly, "is often how the most significant mistakes occur. We do not set out to do a wrong, we simply stop noticing when we have crossed the line between right and wrong, between help and interference. The important thing is what we do once we recognize what has happened." They sat together for some time in silence, broken only by the gentle sound of rain against the windows. Finally, Mrs. Moore rose to leave, her composure partially restored though her expression remained troubled. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "I cannot say that this conversation has been pleasant, but I believe it has been necessary." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied, "those are the same thing." After Mrs. Moore had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The conversation had been difficult, but she believed it had also been important. Mrs. Moore now understood what she had done, and understanding was the first step toward making amends. Chapter 9. What Miss Marple Explained Softly. The rain had cleared by Sunday morning, leaving the village washed clean and glistening in pale sunshine. Miss Marple attended morning service as she always did, observing with interest that Mrs. Moore was also present, seated in her usual pew, but looking rather more subdued than was characteristic. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythms, and afterward the congregation dispersed into small conversational groups on the church steps and in the graveyard. Miss Marple found herself approached by Mrs. Brockhurst, who looked purposeful and somewhat relieved. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, drawing her slightly apart from the others, "I received a visit from Mrs. Moore yesterday evening. She returned my spare key, the one that hangs in the pantry, and she also gave me the second key, the one that had been found at Mr. Fletcher's shop. She said she owed me an explanation and an apology." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And did she provide the explanation?" "She did." Mrs. Brockhurst's expression was complex, combining satisfaction with something that might have been compassion. "She told me that she had commissioned the second key herself several years ago, when I was away visiting my sister. She said she had thought it would be convenient to have access to my house in case of emergencies, and that she had intended to mention it to me, but had somehow never got round to doing so. She apologised for the presumption and for allowing me to doubt my own memory when the key was discovered." "That must have been difficult for her to admit," Miss Marple observed. "I believe it was," Mrs. Brockhurst agreed. "She was quite distressed, though she maintained her composure. She also mentioned that she would be returning keys to several other people in the village and stepping back from some of her committee responsibilities. She felt it would be better for everyone if she were less central to village affairs for a time." "A wise decision," Miss Marple said gently, "though I hope people will not be too harsh in their judgment of her." "I confess I was angry at first," Mrs. Brockhurst admitted. "The knowledge that she had been entering my house without my awareness, that she had allowed me to be made to feel confused and forgetful when she knew perfectly well what had happened. It felt like a betrayal. But she seemed genuinely remorseful, and I find it difficult to sustain anger towards someone who is clearly suffering from their own recognition of what they have done." They were joined then by Dr. Haydock, who had been speaking with the vicar and now approached with his characteristic directness. "I understand there have been some developments in the key situation," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Moore came to see me this morning, returned the spare I'd given her years ago, and apologised for what she called overstepping. She was not entirely clear about the details, but she seemed genuinely distressed. I don't suppose either of you knows what this is all about." Miss Marple and Mrs. Brockhurst exchanged glances, and after a moment Mrs. Brockhurst provided a brief explanation of what had transpired. Dr. Haydock listened with growing seriousness, his expression darkening as the full implications became clear. "Good Lord," he said when she had finished. "I had no idea the situation had developed to that extent. I knew she was helpful, of course, but I never imagined she had been entering people's homes without their knowledge. That's a serious violation of trust." "It is," Miss Marple agreed, "though I believe it developed gradually, rather than through any deliberate intention to deceive. Mrs. Moore convinced herself that she was acting in everyone's best interests, and she lost sight of the fact that good intentions do not justify unauthorized intrusion. Still," Dr. Haydock said, "the woman should have known better. She's intelligent enough to understand boundaries." "Intelligence and self-awareness are not always the same thing," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Moore became so invested in her role as helper that she could no longer see where help ended and interference began. "It is a common enough failing, particularly among those who define themselves entirely through service to others." The doctor grunted, unconvinced but willing to let the matter rest. They spoke for a few minutes more about other village matters and then separated to make their ways home. That afternoon, Miss Marple received another visitor. Mrs. Price arrived looking considerably less anxious than she had during their previous encounter, and she accepted tea with evident pleasure. "I wanted to thank you," she said, after they had settled themselves comfortably. "Mrs. Moore came to see me yesterday and returned the key I'd given her 3 years ago. She apologized for what she called taking liberties with the trust I'd placed in her. She admitted that she'd occasionally let herself into my cottage when I was out, not for any improper purpose, but simply to check that everything was in order. She said she understood now that this had been wrong, regardless of her intentions. "And how do you feel about her admission?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Price considered this carefully. "I am relieved, primarily. For so long I'd been telling myself that I was imagining things, that I was being foolish and nervous. To learn that my observations were accurate, that small things genuinely had been moved because someone had been in my house. It validates feelings I had been taught to dismiss. That matters more than I can easily express." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said with sympathy. "It is deeply unsettling to be made to doubt one's own perceptions." "Yes, exactly." Mrs. Price leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. And Mrs. Moore's apology, while I appreciate it, also made me realise something important. She never asked whether I minded her checking on my cottage. She simply assumed that because I was nervous by nature, I would benefit from her oversight. She made a judgment about what I needed without consulting me, and in doing so she treated me rather as one might treat a child who cannot be trusted to manage their own affairs. "That is a very astute observation," Miss Marple said. "I may be nervous," Mrs. Price continued, "but I am not incompetent. I am perfectly capable of managing my own household, and I ought to have been allowed to do so without someone else deciding that I required supervision." She paused, then added, "I must admit, I find it rather liberating to be able to say that aloud." "Good," Miss Marple said warmly. "You should say it aloud more often. There is nothing wrong with being cautious or careful, Mrs. Price. Those are sensible qualities, not weaknesses to be managed by others." After Mrs. Price had left, Miss Marple sat for some time reflecting on the various conversations of the day. The truth had emerged, as she had known it would, and Mrs. Moore had taken responsibility for her actions, with what appeared to be genuine remorse. The village would adjust, people would recalibrate their relationships with Mrs. Moore, and in time the matter would settle into the sort of story that was occasionally remembered but rarely discussed. Yet Miss Marple found herself thinking not about the resolution itself, but about what it revealed about human nature and the subtle ways in which good intentions could transform into something quite different. Mrs. Moore had begun with a sincere desire to help. There was no doubt about that. But somewhere in the process of helping, she had discovered that being helpful gave her a certain kind of power. The power of knowing things others did not know, of having access to places others could not reach, of being indispensable in ways that made her feel valuable and important. That power had been intoxicating, perhaps more so because it had been acquired through kindness rather than through force. No one had questioned Mrs. Moore's helpfulness because helpfulness seemed like such an unambiguously good quality. And yet, as Miss Marple had observed many times before, any quality taken to excess could become its opposite. Helpfulness, when it crossed certain boundaries, became control. Care, when it disregarded consent, became intrusion. The village had learned something valuable through this incident, though Miss Marple doubted many people would articulate it in quite these terms. They had learned that trust required boundaries, that access should be limited to specific purposes, and that even the most well-intentioned person could overstep if they were not regularly reminded of the limits of their authority. More significantly, perhaps, people like Mrs. Price and Mrs. Brockhurst had learned that their own perceptions and feelings deserved respect, even when those perceptions contradicted the prevailing narrative. They had learned that feeling uneasy about something was often justified, and that doubt was not always a sign of weakness, but sometimes a signal that something genuinely required attention. Miss Marple thought about the various small incidents that had accumulated over the years. Mrs. Fortescue's medication, the Bartlett's pantry door, Mrs. Price's displaced belongings. Each one had seemed insignificant on its own, easily explained away as coincidence or innocent oversight. But taken together, they had formed a pattern, and that pattern had revealed a truth that would have remained hidden if Mrs. Brockhurst had not trusted her own certainty enough to pursue the question of the second key. It occurred to Miss Marple that this was often how truth emerged, not through dramatic revelations or shocking discoveries, but through the gradual accumulation of small observations that eventually formed a coherent picture. One noticed a detail here, a discrepancy there, and showed explanation that did not quite satisfy. And if one paid attention to these small things rather than dismissing them, the truth eventually revealed itself. The difficulty lay in maintaining that attention, in not allowing oneself to be discouraged by reassurances or distracted by plausible explanations. It required a certain stubbornness, perhaps, or at least a willingness to trust one's own judgment even when that judgment was questioned by others. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and resumed the steady, rhythmic work that had accompanied so much of her thinking over the years. The situation with Mrs. Moore had been resolved as well as could reasonably be expected. Mrs. Moore had acknowledged her mistakes, made her apologies, and taken concrete steps to ensure the situation would not continue. Those who had been affected had received explanations and, in most cases, had chosen to extend understanding rather than condemnation. The village would move forward, as villages always did, absorbing the incident into its collective memory and adjusting its patterns accordingly. Mrs. Moore would find new ways to be useful that did not require quite so much access to other people's private lives, and people would, perhaps, be slightly more careful about whom they trusted with their keys and why. It was not a dramatic conclusion, but then, Miss Marple reflected, the most important conclusions rarely were. They were quiet adjustments, small recognitions, subtle shifts in understanding that accumulated over time into wisdom. Through the window she could see the village going about its Sunday afternoon business. Children played on the green, couples walked together along the lanes. Someone was working in their garden, making the most of the sunshine after the rain. All perfectly ordinary, all exactly as it should be. And yet, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, significantly different from how it had been just a fortnight ago. The truth had been uncovered, acknowledged and addressed. That mattered, even if the uncovering had been quiet and the addressing had been done with compassion rather than punishment. Justice, Miss Marple had learned long ago, did not always require grand gestures. Sometimes it simply required that truth be told, mistakes be acknowledged, and people be given the opportunity to do better. And in St. Mary Mead, on this particular Sunday in May, that was precisely what had occurred. Chapter 10. After the locks were quietly changed. 3 weeks passed, and May deepened into the fuller warmth that preceded summer. The village fete took place on a cloudless Saturday, and the proceeds were satisfactory if not exceptional. Mrs. Moore attended, though she did not coordinate any of the stalls. She helped where asked, and otherwise maintained a pleasant but unobtrusive presence that several people remarked upon as showing admirable restraint. Miss Marple, stationed at the tea tent for the afternoon shift, observed these interactions with her customary attention to detail. Mrs. Moore appeared to be navigating her altered position with reasonable grace, accepting the subtle shift in how people approached her without either defiance or excessive contrition was, Miss Marple reflected, probably the best outcome that could have been hoped for under the circumstances. The following Tuesday, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Brockhurst at the greengrocer's and they fell naturally into conversation while selecting vegetables. Mrs. Brockhurst looked considerably more relaxed than she had during any of their previous encounters, and when Miss Marple remarked upon this, she smiled with genuine warmth. "I have had the locks changed," she said simply. "It seemed the sensible thing to do, and I must say it has given me a sense of security I had not realized I was missing. I know precisely who has keys to my house now, and I know that those keys are being used only for the purposes I have authorized. It is remarkably liberating." "I am glad to hear it," Miss Marple said. "And have you proceeded with the changes to your will that you mentioned?" "I have," Mrs. Brockhurst confirmed. "My solicitor came out from London last week, and everything has been arranged exactly as I wished. My niece in Canada will be well provided for, and I have made several other adjustments that reflect my own preferences, rather than what others might think appropriate. It feels good to have my affairs in proper order and entirely under my own control." They parted shortly after, and Miss Marple continued her shopping with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The matter had resolved itself in a manner that allowed for both truth and dignity, which was not always possible in human affairs. That afternoon, Miss Marple was working in her garden when Mrs. Price appeared at the gate, carrying a basket and looking almost cheerful. Miss Marple invited her in, and they sat together in the sunshine while Mrs. Price explained the purpose of her visit. "I have brought you some strawberries from my garden," she said, presenting the basket. "They came in rather abundantly this year, and I wanted to share them with someone who's been kind to me. You help me to trust my own judgment, Miss Marple, and I cannot adequately express what a difference that has made." "The strawberries are thanks enough," Miss Marple assured her. "Though I am curious, have you found the change in circumstances difficult to navigate?" "Not difficult exactly," Mrs. Price said thoughtfully, "though it has required some adjustment. I find myself more willing to speak up when something troubles me, rather than assuming I must be mistaken or overly sensitive. Just yesterday, the butcher tried to give me a cut of meat that was not what I had ordered, and instead of accepting it apologetically, I pointed out the error and insisted on receiving what I had actually requested. It seems a small thing, but for me it represented a significant shift." "Those small shifts often lead to larger changes," Miss Marple observed. "You are learning to advocate for yourself, which is a valuable skill at any stage of life." Mrs. Price nodded, then added with a slight hesitation, "I have also made a decision regarding Mrs. Moore. She wrote me a very thoughtful letter last week asking if I would be willing to serve with her on the library committee. She said she valued my perspective and thought I had been overlooked for too long in village affairs. I have decided to accept." "I think that is generous of you," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps," Mrs. Price agreed, "but I also think it is fair. Mrs. Moore made mistakes, certainly, but she has acknowledged them and is making genuine efforts to do better. I see no reason to hold her past behaviour against her indefinitely, particularly when she is trying to change. We shall see how it develops, but I am willing to give her the opportunity to demonstrate that she has learned from what happened." After Mrs. Price had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while enjoying the strawberries and reflecting on the various ways people responded to revelation and change. Some, like Mrs. Brockhurst, used the experience as an opportunity to reclaim authority over their own lives. Others, like Mrs. Price, discovered unexpected reserves of confidence, and still others, like Mrs. Moore, were given the chance to understand themselves more clearly and to adjust their behaviour accordingly. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather like pruning roses. One removed what had grown too wild or intrusive, creating space for healthier growth. The process was sometimes painful, but the result was generally stronger and more sustainable than what had existed before. A few days later, Miss Marple had occasion to speak with Dr. Haydock again, who had called to check on an elderly patient who lived nearby, and had stopped to exchange a few words over the garden wall. "The village seems to have settled down after all the excitement," he observed, "though I gather Mrs. Moore is finding her new, more limited role somewhat challenging." "Is she unwell?" Miss Marple asked with concern. "Not physically," de Haydock assured her, "but I think she is struggling with the loss of what she had built for herself, that sense of being essential to everyone's well-being. She told me during her last appointment that she feels rather adrift, uncertain of her purpose now, that she is no longer coordinating quite so much of village life." "That is understandable," Miss Marple said. "She had defined herself entirely through that role, and now she must discover who she is apart from it. That is never easy, but it is often necessary." "I suggested she might consider taking up some pursuit that was entirely for her own benefit, rather than for others," de Haydock said. "Something that would allow her to develop interests and skills that had nothing to do with being useful to the village. She seemed intrigued by the idea, though also somewhat uncertain about what such a pursuit might be." "She will find her way," Miss Marple said with confidence. "People generally do, given sufficient time and support. The important thing is that she now understands the difference between helping others and managing them, and that understanding will serve her well as she rebuilds her place in the community." As June arrived, and the village continued its eternal cycle of seasons and social rhythms, Miss Marple had occasion to observe Mrs. Moore from time to time. The woman attended church services and village events, participated in committees when invited but did not dominate them, and gradually began to develop what appeared to be a genuine interest in watercolour painting, a pursuit that required no access to other people's homes and posed no risk of overstepping boundaries. It was not a dramatic transformation, but then Miss Marple had long ago learned that the most meaningful changes rarely were. Mrs. Moore would never again occupy quite the position she had held before, but she seemed to be finding a more balanced way of contributing to village life, one that respected other people's autonomy while still allowing her to be useful in appropriate ways. One evening in mid-June, as Miss Marple sat with her knitting and watched the long twilight settle over her garden, she found herself thinking back over the entire incident, from the initial discovery of the second key to the final quiet adjustments in how people related to one another. It had been a study in how trust operated in small communities and what happened when that trust was violated, even unintentionally. The key itself had been such a small thing, a piece of metal, easily copied, apparently insignificant, and yet it had represented something much larger. The question of who had the right to enter private spaces, who had the authority to make decisions about other people's lives, and where the line fell between being helpful and being intrusive.